We proved everything, and still, it changed almost nothing. There are moments when history does not arrive with noise, but with quiet accumulation. Paper stacked on paper, numbers written and rewritten until they no longer belong to any single life, but to something larger. I did not build anything you could see from the street. No factory, no bridge, no monument. I worked in a room where the work was smaller, slower, and yet, in its own way, irreversible. Because once something is measured correctly, once it is written down without error, it begins to exist differently in the world. I will tell you about paper first, because that is where it all began for me. Not with ideas, not with speeches, not with the grand pronouncements that other men made from podiums I was too young and too unknown to stand behind. It began with paper, reams of it. Foolscap sheets, census forms, hand-ruled ledger pages, the soft gray stock that the university printing office used when the budget was thin, which was most months. I will tell you about the smell of it, cold paper in a cold room, the particular staleness of ink that is dried in stacks, the faint mustiness of documents that have traveled through the mail from counties I had never visited and might never visit. There is something about the smell of cold paper in January that I associate, to this day, with the beginning of serious work. Not the excitement of beginning, that is a different feeling entirely, warmer and more volatile. The smell of cold paper is the smell of work that has already been decided upon. Work you have agreed to do and are now doing without fanfare, because the doing is the point. My name is Samuel Carter. I was 24 years old in the January of 1899, and I had come to Philadelphia from Baltimore the previous autumn, following a letter and a small amount of hope. The letter had come from Professor Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, though I did not yet call him that informally. I called him Professor, always, and sometimes Sir when I was uncertain of myself, which was often in those first months. He had written to my former instructor at the colored high school in Baltimore, a man named Mr. Tobias Weems, who had taught mathematics and surveying and who believed, with a stubbornness I have come to admire in retrospect, that precision was a form of dignity. Not a tool of dignity, not a pathway toward dignity. Precision was dignity. The insistence on getting it right was itself a refusal of a certain kind of diminishment. I did not fully understand this when I sat in Mr. Weems's classroom. I understand it now. Mr. Weems had recommended me. The letter to him, which he read aloud to me, seated at his desk in the school's small administrative office, with the November light coming in sideways through the window, said that there was work in Philadelphia, at the University of Pennsylvania, in the sociology department, assisting with the study of Negro life in the 7th Ward. It said the work would be demanding and the pay modest. It said the work would matter. He looked at me over the letter when he finished reading. He asked, "Can you do the work?" I said I believed I could. He said, "That is not the same thing as yes." I said, "Yes." He nodded. He folded the letter and handed it to me. I packed a trunk and took the train north. The office was on the 4th floor of a building on Locust Street, 2 blocks west of the university's main campus. I remember the stairs, a narrow wooden staircase that turned twice, with a landing on the 2nd floor where someone had left a coat rack that was never used, the coat rack standing there empty all winter, as though waiting for a guest who had decided not to come. 4 flights up, a door with frosted glass, and behind the glass, 2 rooms. The inner room was Professor Du Bois's. I learned early not to enter it without being asked. Not because he was harsh about such things, he was not particularly, but because the room had a quality of concentrated intention that made intrusion feel wrong, the way you feel wrong walking through a beam of light in a church. He was in there most mornings by 7, and he worked with a focused rapidity that I had never seen before in a person of his kind of intelligence. Most very clever people I had known were also, to varying degrees, performatively thoughtful. They let you see them thinking. Professor Du Bois did his thinking somewhere I could not observe, and delivered the results into the world as finished sentences, finished arguments, finished tables. The outer room was mine, and Cornelius's, and whoever else came and went that winter. It held 2 large work tables, a set of shelves along the east wall, the unreliable radiator, and a window that looked out over the back of a neighboring building's roof, a view of tar paper and a water tower, and on clear days, a distant wedge of sky. I grew fond of that window. It asked nothing of me. The surveys arrived by mail each morning in bundles tied with brown string. They came from canvassers who had been going door to door through the 7th Ward, through its alleys and tenements and boarding houses, and the few streets where colored families of some means had managed to establish themselves. Each bundle was from a different sub-district, and each bundle was a different weight, which told you something before you opened it. A heavy bundle meant a densely populated sub-district, many households in close proximity. A thin bundle meant the outskirts, the places where the ward dissolved into something else. I untied the bundles carefully, because the string was sometimes the only thing keeping a set of forms in order, and a disordered set of forms was an afternoon of lost work. I set the bundles in sequence along the table before opening any of them. This was not a rule I had been given. It was a habit I developed in the first week, a kind of preliminary ceremony, the way you lay out your tools before beginning a repair. The surveys were the central instrument of the study. Professor Du Bois had designed them himself. I know this because I had seen the drafts, the crossed-out questions, the marginal notes in his sharp, slanting hand. What do you do for work? How much do you earn each week? How many rooms do you occupy? Do you own the furniture? Is there a bathtub? How many people sleep in each room? What church do you attend, if you attend? Have you been arrested? Have members of your family been arrested? How long have you lived in Philadelphia? What brought you to the city? That last question, what brought you to the city, was not in all versions of the form. It appeared on some and not others, depending on which canvasser had used which version. When it appeared, the answers tended to be brief. Work. Family already here. Left the South. Sometimes, could not stay where I was. That answer appeared on 11 forms in the first month of my sorting, and each time I encountered it, I made a small mark in the margin of my note sheet, not because it changed the data, but because I wanted to keep track of how many people had needed to say it. I would like to explain what sorting means when you are sorting the truth of people's lives. It is not the same as sorting correspondence or sorting inventory. Each form I held had been filled out by a real person in a real room, or more likely had been filled out for them by one of the canvassers who had gone door to door. The handwriting on many of the forms was not the respondent's. It was a canvasser's neat transcription of answers given aloud, sometimes in a hallway, sometimes on a stoop, sometimes through a partially open door by someone who did not want to be seen speaking with anyone who carried a clipboard. Some respondents had answered in writing themselves, and their handwriting told you things the answers did not. A careful, labored cursive that suggested someone who had come to literacy later in life, or the quick, practiced hand of someone educated, or the irregular, self-taught printing of someone who had taught themselves and was still teaching themselves, even now, in the act of filling out this form. I sorted by occupation first. There were categories Professor Du Bois had established: professional and semi-professional men, skilled workers, unskilled workers, service workers, those without regular work. Each category had a shelf, and each shelf had a ledger where I was to note the names and ward subdistricts before filing. The names were not for the published study. The published study would use numbers, not names. But we kept the names for verification, for the possibility of follow-up, for the simple human reason that Professor Du Bois insisted we not lose sight of the fact that every number had once been a person who answered a question. My neighbor in Baltimore, a woman named Mrs. Esther Hodge, who took in washing and whose husband had died of a chest illness 3 years prior, would have appeared in the unskilled service category. I thought about her when I filed those forms. I thought, she is here. Not by name, but her arithmetic is here. Her weekly earnings, her 2 rooms, her 3 boarders who helped cover the rent, her eldest son who was 14 and already working at the railway yard. All of it rendered into columns. All of it becoming eventually a number that would sit inside a larger number that would sit inside a table that would sit inside a book that Professor Du Bois was writing with a furious, meticulous patience I had never seen in anyone before or since. There was a discipline required in this that I had not anticipated. The discipline was not arithmetic. I had always been comfortable with arithmetic. The discipline was something more like emotional accounting, the ability to know what you knew about a life and still treat its numerical expression as just a number, neither more nor less than what it said. To grieve privately if grief came, and then to file correctly. To feel, and then to check the column twice. Not to suppress feeling. I do not think suppression serves accuracy in the long run, but to hold it separate from the column, to let it exist in its proper place, which was not inside the ledger. The cold that January was severe. The building's heating was inconsistent. There was a radiator in the outer room that worked perhaps 3 mornings out of 5, and on the mornings it did not work, I wore my coat while I sorted. The coat was a dark gray wool, a good one that my mother had helped me buy before I left Baltimore, and it smelled faintly of the cedar in her closet. On the cold mornings, I was glad of the smell. It was company. My fingers were sometimes stiff. I made errors occasionally, misfiled a form, transposed a number in my note sheet, and when I discovered an error, I noted it in a separate ledger I kept for exactly this purpose. It was a small red notebook that I had bought myself, not reimbursed by the department, because I had decided early that the error log was mine, a personal record of the gap between what I had done and what should have been done, and what I had subsequently done to close the gap. I believed, without being able to articulate it clearly at the time, that errors ought to be tracked as carefully as correct data. The accounting of mistakes was part of the work. You could not trust a result that had no record of what had been corrected on the way to it. Professor Du Bois saw the red notebook once, when he came into the outer room to look for a particular survey from the Addison Street subdistrict. He picked it up, examined the first few pages, the careful columns of date, error description, correction made, date verified, set it back down without comment. He found the survey he needed and returned to his room. 2 days later, he mentioned, in a conversation with Cornelius that I was not directly part of, but could hear from my table, that careful error tracking was the mark of a person who understood that truth was something you approached, never something you arrived at completely. I am not certain he meant me to hear it. I heard it anyway. I wrote it down that evening in my personal journal, the journal I kept separate from everything else, the place where I wrote what I actually thought about things, as opposed to what could be expressed in a ledger column. The sentence went into the journal, and then I read it back, and I understood that Mr. Weems had been trying to tell me something similar for 3 years, and had perhaps not found the exact words. Outside, Philadelphia went about its winter business in the way that large cities do, loudly, without particular concern for whether you were warm. I walked to the office each morning from my rented room on Woodland Avenue, 4 blocks south of the university. The walk took 12 minutes in ordinary weather, and longer when it had snowed, because the sidewalks in my neighborhood were cleared later than the sidewalks in the university's immediate vicinity, a fact I noted without bitterness, but with the precise attention I was learning to bring to such things. The disparity was a data point. The 7th Ward itself, the ward we were studying, was a neighborhood I passed through on some mornings when I varied my route. South Street, where the grocery stalls opened early, and the Iceman's horse stood patient in the cold, and the smell of bread from a Jewish bakery on the corner reached you half a block away. Bainbridge Street, where the row houses sat close together, and the steps were freshly scrubbed even on the cold mornings by women who had decided that a scrubbed step was something they could control, and who were right. The courts and alleys between the broader streets, the ones that did not appear on the standard city maps because they had been built informally, over time, by the logic of need rather than the logic of planning. Someone had needed to house people. Housing had been built. The city had grown around it without acknowledging it. I walked these streets to understand what the numbers were describing. When I filed a form that said alley dwelling, 2 rooms, 6 occupants, I wanted to have seen the alleys. I had seen them. Narrow enough that 2 people carrying bundles could not pass side by side without turning. Mud in winter, which froze at night and thawed into a different kind of mud in the afternoon. Privies at the end of the court, shared by however many families happened to live there. Children who went to school when school was possible and did not go when other things intervened. Illness, the need to watch younger siblings, the simple arithmetic of a family that needed another pair of hands. There is a particular discipline in seeing a place, and then returning to its columns, in refusing to let the seeing become noise that distorts the numbers or sentimentality that inflates them. The numbers had to be accurate. That was the whole argument. That was what Professor Du Bois understood with a clarity I was still learning. The numbers, if accurate, would make arguments that no speech could make as cleanly. A person who said the colored residents of Philadelphia's 7th Ward live in desperate poverty could be dismissed as biased, as agitated, as one of those. A table that showed exactly how many rooms, exactly how many people, exactly how much earned per week, per year. A table like that was harder to dismiss. Not impossible, but harder. And in 1899, harder was something. Harder was worth the cold mornings and the stiff fingers and the careful double checks. The other assistant, Cornelius, was a year older than me and had come from the Institute for Colored Youth on Bainbridge Street, which was one of the finer schools in the city for colored students, and which had produced, over its history, a remarkable number of people who went on to do remarkable things in quiet ways. Cornelius was quicker with mental arithmetic than me by a significant margin. I have always been a person who needs to write the intermediate steps, who does not fully trust a calculation until he can see it on paper. But he was impatient with checking his work. This impatience was the central fact of our working relationship, and the source of a friction we managed by mostly not discussing it directly. He worked mornings, I worked afternoons and sometimes into the evening, when a batch of surveys arrived late, or when a table needed to be completed for Professor Du Bois's review the following day. We overlapped for perhaps 2 hours each day, during which we handed off materials and occasionally discussed what we were finding in the data. These conversations were the best part of working with Cornelius. When he was not in a hurry, when he was simply looking at something and thinking, his mind moved in interesting directions. One afternoon in late February, he showed me something that made me set down my pen and look. He had been sorting the occupation forms for the sub-district around Lombard Street and had found a cluster of forms for men who listed their occupation as musician or music teacher. 11 of them, from within 4 blocks of each other. He had laid them out on the table side by side, not because the study required this, not because any instruction had asked him to notice this pattern, but because he had noticed it and wanted to look at it properly. There is a whole musical society in 3 blocks, he said. He said it with a kind of pleasure, the way you feel when you find something hidden. I looked at the forms. $12 a week, $8, $15 for the teacher who listed 3 private pupils. Church affiliations, AME, Baptist, Presbyterian. One man had written, in the margin of the form where there was no question asking for additional information, simply in small, careful letters, I play violin at the Academy of Music when they need me, but am not listed on the programs. He had wanted us to know this. The survey had offered him 12 questions with fixed answers, and in the margin beside those questions, he had written 1 sentence more, the sentence the survey had not thought to ask for, the fact of himself that he most needed to place somewhere on the record. He had seen the survey as an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity he had been given, to say a thing he could not otherwise say in a form that would be kept, that would be part of something, that would exist beyond the evening of his saying it. I made a note in the red notebook. Not because it affected the data, it did not. His occupation remained musician in the column, but because I felt the note belonged somewhere. The impulse to leave something behind, even on a form that asked only for numbers. I understood that impulse very well. Spring arrived slowly that year. The cold held through most of March, retreating in increments too small to trust, so that you would go out on a Wednesday morning in what felt like genuine warmth and return to your room in the evening through a wind that reminded you March was not done with you yet. By April, the change was real. The windows of the outer office, which had been sealed against the cold since November, were opened for the first time, and the street sounds came in. Cart horses, voices, the particular rhythm of a city that has remembered it is alive. The study was reaching what Professor Du Bois called the analysis phase, which meant the collected forms were beginning to be transformed into tables, charts, and eventually, prose. My work shifted. Less sorting, more calculation. I was given a ledger, a large one, bound in green cloth, with Professor Du Bois's handwriting on the cover. Seventh Ward Income and Occupancy Analysis. My task was to take the sorted forms and produce from them the summary tables the professor had specified in a set of written instructions. 3 pages of them, precise to a degree I had come to recognize as characteristic. A column for each income category, a row for each subdistrict, the figures to be given both as raw numbers and as percentages of the total for that subdistrict. A second table for occupancy, rooms per household, persons per room, comparison between households that owned their furniture and those that rented it from the landlord, which was more common than I had known before starting this work. A third table for employment stability, how many months of steady work in the past year, and for those who had experienced periods of unemployment, what had been the primary cause. The causes offered on the form were illness, seasonal fluctuation in the trade, dismissal without stated reason, difficulty finding work in the respondent's occupation, discrimination in hiring, other. I was to tabulate each cause as a percentage of total unemployment periods reported, both overall and by subdistrict. The discrimination column gave me trouble. Not arithmetically, the arithmetic was simple enough once the data was properly organized. It gave me trouble in a different way, one that I had not been prepared for and could not have anticipated without having done work of this kind before. I had grown up in Baltimore, knowing what discrimination in hiring looked like from the inside of a life. My father had been a carpenter, a skilled one. There was not a building in the neighborhood that he had not worked on, and there were buildings outside the neighborhood he had worked on too, when contractors needed skilled hands and were willing to overlook the question of color in the interest of completing a job correctly and on time. But he could not join the carpenters' union. The union did not accept colored members, and it stated this plainly, and there was no legal remedy for it, and my father had worked his whole career without the protections the union provided. No mechanism to demand the union wage, no standing in disputes about payment, no protection from dismissal when work was scarce and someone needed to be let go. I knew what the discrimination column was measuring. I had eaten dinner at a table across from what the discrimination column measured. But knowing something in the body, the way you know the weight of a thing you have carried, is different from expressing it as a decimal. The decimal was clean. It was 8.7% of total reported unemployment causes in Subdistrict 4. It was a percentage point that could sit in a table next to other percentage points and be compared. It was not my father's face at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening when there had been no work that week and the rent was Friday. It was not the careful way my mother adjusted what she cooked in those weeks, the adjustments so practiced they were almost invisible, but not quite. It was not those things, and I had to not let it be those things while I was at the table with the green ledger, or the column would be wrong. I would be protecting it from its own smallness, inflating it in some invisible way into something the column could not hold. I wrote the number, 8.7. I checked it against the raw count. I checked it against the subdistrict total. It was correct. I wrote it in the ledger in my cleanest hand and moved on to Subdistrict 5. Later, walking home, I thought, the number is doing the work. You do not have to be the number and also do the work. Let the number carry what it carries. That is what a number is for, to carry something precisely, so that you do not have to carry it imprecisely all the time in your body. I am not sure this thought was entirely true, but it was useful, and useful thoughts have a kind of value even when they are not entirely true. That spring brought a man named James Whitfield to the office 3 times, as an informal advisor to Professor Du Bois on the condition of colored-owned businesses in the ward. James ran a small printing concern on South Street, church bulletins, lodge programs, personal stationery. He was perhaps 40, with gray at his temples and hands permanently stained at the creases with press ink, a different ink from the India ink I used, darker and more complex in its smell. He and Professor Du Bois would sit in the inner office for an hour at a time, and I would hear the rhythm of their conversation without the words. On his second visit, James stopped at my table when he left. He looked at the green ledger lying open, at the stacks of sorted forms in their categorized shelves. He said, "What does it say?" I began to tell him the median household income in subdistricts 2 through 6, the unemployment rate, the distribution across occupation categories. He raised one inked hand. Not what the numbers say. What does it say? It says, I said slowly, that people are managing circumstances that are not of their making, with considerable ingenuity, and that the ingenuity does not appear anywhere in the official record except here. Good, he said. Make sure that part gets in. I thought about that for several days afterward. Whether ingenuity could be captured in a table, whether the table could hold it. I concluded, eventually, that the table itself could not, but that the explanatory text beside the table could, if the text was written by someone who had held the forms and understood what was between the columns. I made a note of this in the red notebook. The news about Sam Hose reached me on a morning in late April, not through the newspaper first, but through Mrs. Patterson, the woman from whom I rented my room. She told me at breakfast with her hands very still on the table, the particular stillness that I had come to recognize in people who were controlling something large inside themselves. She told me the bare facts, because that was all anyone knew yet. A man in Georgia, a mob, a death of the kind that newspapers, even the white Philadelphia papers, described with a specificity that turned the stomach and occupied the mind afterward in ways you did not choose. I read the accounts in the papers over the following days. I will not reproduce those accounts here. What I will say is that the reading of them was its own kind of injury, not the same as having been present, not the same as the injury borne by those who lived in Georgia, and for whom this was not a distant horror, but a local fact, a weather condition under which they lived their lives. But an injury nonetheless, to the part of you that had believed, perhaps foolishly, that the careful construction of accurate records would be enough to change something, to make something impossible that was still, evidently, entirely possible. I heard Professor Du Bois's voice in the inner office the day after the story broke in the papers. I could not hear the words. He was speaking to someone I never identified, someone who came and left in the time it took me to finish copying a column of figures. But I heard the voice, and it was flatter than his usual speaking voice, flat in the way a very tightly drawn wire is flat, taut, controlled, holding something that needed holding. I have learned since, through accounts written years later, that Professor Du Bois had intended to write a careful, scholarly response to the Hose case and bring it to a newspaper editor, a precise, documented refutation of the justifications offered. He was on his way to do this when he passed a store window and saw something displayed there that I will not describe. He turned around and did not deliver the piece. Something shifted in him that day about what scholarship could do and could not do, and the shift took years to work itself fully into his thinking. At the time, in the outer office, I only knew that the atmosphere had changed key. The work continued. The columns still needed filling, but the filling was done in a slightly different register, quieter perhaps, more aware of its own limitations. I entered my numbers. I checked them twice. I thought about what the numbers were able to say and what they were not able to say, and I held both of those things at the same time in the same body, and I understood that the holding was itself a labor that would not appear in any table, that could not be entered into any column, that was simply part of what it cost to do this work honestly. The book was becoming real. The Philadelphia Negro. That was the title Professor Du Bois had settled on by late spring, after some deliberation. A real book, to be published by the University of Pennsylvania, to sit on shelves in libraries and offices, and the occasional parlor of the kind of person who kept serious books in their parlor. The manuscript was being assembled piece by piece, and my work shifted again. I became not quite an author, and not quite a typist, but something in between. The person who prepared the tables for the manuscript. Preparing tables for a manuscript in 1899 meant hand-drawing them. There was no other method. Each table had to be drawn on paper, the lines ruled with a straight edge, the column headers lettered, the figures copied from the green ledger into the cells with a fine nibbed pen. Each table took between 2 and 4 hours, depending on complexity. A simple 2-column table with a dozen rows might be done in an afternoon. The multivariable tables showing occupation, income, and sub-district simultaneously took a full day, sometimes more when I needed to recalculate to confirm a figure that did not look right against the surrounding figures. Professor Du Bois reviewed each table and returned it with corrections marked in red pencil. Some corrections were of substance, a figure that needed to be recalculated from the original forms, and some were of form, where a column header was ambiguous, or a row label lacked sufficient specificity, or a total was positioned where it might be misread as a subtotal. He was precise about the tables in a way that he was not always precise about prose. The prose he revised willingly, sometimes dramatically, sometimes adding whole paragraphs and then removing them. The tables he examined with a thoroughness that went beyond correction into something more like examination. He would look at a table for several minutes before marking anything, and I sometimes thought he was reading the table the way a doctor reads a face, looking for what the structure implied beyond what it stated. One morning in late July, he called me into the inner office, the first time he had done this, and set a table in front of me. The table showing the distribution of weekly wages across the occupation categories. "Look at it," he said, "and tell me what you see." I looked. I told him I saw that the professional category had a median weekly wage considerably higher than the skilled worker category, which in turn was higher than the unskilled and service categories, which was expected. "And the range?" he asked. I looked more carefully. The range within the professional category was substantially wider than the range within the unskilled category. Some professionals were earning comfortably. Others were earning barely more than skilled tradesmen. The spread was twice what you would expect if the professional category behaved the way such categories were supposed to behave. "The professional category has the widest variance," I said. "Some earning well, some earning barely above the skilled worker rate." "Why?" he asked. Just that. Not as a challenge, as a genuine question, directed at me, as though my answer might contain something he had not already considered. I do not know if that was true. It might have been a pedagogical strategy. It felt like a genuine question, I thought. I said, "Because a colored professional operates in a constrained market. A colored physician cannot generally practice in white hospitals or attract white patients. A colored lawyer has limited access to white clients and white courts. The credential and the training are present, but the income the credential would typically command is restricted by the segregation of the market in which it must be exercised. The variance reflects not differential ability, but differential access." Write that. Not in the table. In the paragraph below the table. One sentence. Precisely. I wrote, "The wide variance within the professional category reflects not unequal educational attainment, but the artificial constraint of a segregated market that confines the professional's client base to those communities least able to pay standard professional fees." He read it. He changed one word, differential to unequal, and handed it back. That was, I believe, the first sentence of mine that entered the manuscript of the Philadelphia Negro in any form. A single sentence, and not entirely my own, with his correction inside it. But there it was. My thinking had passed through his revision and come out the other side still recognizable, still containing what I had meant to say. That is perhaps the most you can hope for when you are 24 and working for someone who is 31 and already knows something about the relationship between a true fact and the language needed to carry it. Autumn arrived, and with it, the Paris project, which had been developing in the inner office through conversations I was not party to, but could sense in the changed texture of the days. Professor Du Bois told me directly one afternoon in September, when we were both working late and the building had gone quiet around us. He had agreed, he said, to compile an exhibit for the Exposition Universelle, the Paris World's Fair of 1900, which was expected to be the largest such exposition of the century. The exhibit would be called The Exhibit of American Negroes. It would be displayed in the Negro building at the fair. He had been asked to prepare statistical charts and graphs, photographs, books and pamphlets, documentation of Negro life and progress since emancipation. "The charts," he said, "will need to be drawn by hand. larger than the manuscript tables. The exposition format requires materials readable from a distance of 6 to 10 feet. Visitors will be moving through a large hall. They will stop for perhaps 5 minutes. I understood the difference. The manuscript tables were for readers, for people who would sit with the book and examine the figures closely, who had chosen to give their attention. The exposition charts were for people who were moving, who might not have chosen to stop, who would give a few minutes to something that needed to make its argument in those minutes, without the benefit of a paragraph of explanatory text beside it. The chart itself had to carry the argument. The chart had to be the argument. "Can you draw?" he asked. I had drawn since childhood. Diagrams mostly, the kind of technical drawing that Mr. Weems had taught alongside mathematics. I said I could draw tolerably. Good. He produced a set of specifications, 4 pages of them, covering the physical dimensions, the topics to be addressed, the color conventions to be followed. He had been thinking about this for some time. The specifications were detailed in the way his instructions always were, but more so. They specified not just what should be shown, but how it should be shown, what the visual hierarchy should be, which comparisons should be drawn with the eye, and which should be spelled out in labels. He had thought about the visitor standing 6 feet away. He had tried to see the chart through that visitor's eyes. I took the specifications home that evening and read them at my table on Woodland Avenue, with the gas lamp burning and the street outside gone quiet. The topics were the increase in the Negro population of Georgia from 1790 to 1890, the comparative occupation distribution between Negro and white populations, the assessed property value of Negro Georgians over time, the distribution of illiteracy rates by age cohort, showing the generational change from those born into slavery to those born free, the city and rural population distribution, the occupations of graduates of Negro colleges and universities, charts covering 100 years, charts that began before emancipation and ended at the present moment and showed in the space between those dates what had happened, what had been built, and under what conditions, and at what cost, and how much remained undone. I sharpened my drawing tools and began. I should describe what it meant to draw a chart by hand, because I think the difference between that and what is possible now is a difference not just of efficiency, but of relationship. When you draw a chart by hand, you live inside the data for the hours it takes to draw it. You do not produce it and move on. You rule each grid line carefully, watching the ruler's edge for the slight drift that comes from an unsteady hand. You plot each data point from the calculated scale, checking twice because a misplotted point will not announce itself. It will simply sit in the wrong place, a small error that becomes visible only when the whole chart is finished, and the eye tracks the line and finds a moment where it seems wrong, where it does not match what you remember from the ledger. For each chart I began with scale calculation. If I was drawing the population growth of Negro Georgians from 1790 to 1890, from approximately 100,000 to approximately 858,000, I needed to determine what vertical distance on the paper corresponded to what number of people, and I needed to make this decision in relation to the paper's dimensions and the requirement that the bars be legible from 6 feet. I could not simply scale by the most convenient fraction. I had to scale by what the eye would read correctly at a distance, which is a different calculation. Then the grid. Then the bars or the lines or the segments, ruled to the calculated scale. Then the labels, in lettering small enough to fit in the allocated space and large enough to be read. Then the title, larger. Then, in many of the charts, color, applied in thin washes following Professor Du Bois's specifications. Red for Negro populations, blue for white populations where comparisons were being drawn, gold for aggregate figures. The colors were to be saturated, clear, unambiguous. He did not want colors that would blur at distance or blend into each other when the light was uncertain. He wanted colors that stood up in a room full of people and announced themselves. I drew in the evenings at my table on Woodland Avenue. The room was small, a desk, a single bed, a shelf, a window that looked onto the street. But the desk was large enough for the chart paper, and the gas lamp, positioned correctly, gave enough light for fine work. The smell of India ink over many evenings became a part of that room, mixed with the smell of the street and the smell of the building's old wood. I associated the smell with concentration, with the particular state of mind in which you are fully present to a single task, and the rest of existence recedes to a comfortable distance. I would finish a chart, sometimes at 10 or 11 in the evening, sometimes later, and hold it flat while the last of the ink dried, then roll it carefully and wrap it in paper for transport the following morning. Professor Du Bois reviewed each one. His corrections came back specific and actionable. The bar for 1870 should be 7/8 of the 1880 bar height. Recheck the census figures. The legend placement obscures the 1885 data point. Move it to the upper left. The title lettering is too light. Re-let in a heavier weight. I would correct and redraw the affected portions, or in some cases the entire chart. The redrawing was not punishment. The redrawing was part of making it right, and making it right was the entire point. By October, I was drawing in every spare hour. The submission deadline for the exposition materials was January, which meant everything needed to be completed and reviewed by mid-December. I had been assigned, between myself and a woman named Miss Eugenia Banks working from Atlanta, approximately 60 charts to produce. I had taken on the majority. Miss Banks had agreed to handle those requiring a more decorative treatment. Some of the charts Professor Du Bois had designed in a spiral format that demanded a steadier artistic hand than I could claim. I never met Miss Banks. I knew her work. You learn a person's hand when you have studied enough of their lettering, and her hand was more naturally elegant than mine, the serifs on her letters finer, the curves of her figures more assured. She was clearly someone who had been formally trained in something adjacent to what she was doing, whether in draftsmanship or commercial art, I could not determine. Once I received a chart back from Professor Du Bois with a note that said simply, "See Miss Banks's treatment of the legend for the spiral chart." I studied her chart carefully. I learned something from it and applied it to my next piece. We were strangers working in parallel toward the same thing, and there is a kind of companionship in that, even across distance and silence. I wrote to her once, a brief professional note, asking a technical question about her method for the color washes on the spiral chart, whether she diluted the ink before applying it or used a separate watercolor wash. She replied, equally brief, equally precise. We were not friends, but we were the same kind of worker, and that was its own form of recognition. It was in October also that I found myself thinking, while drawing the occupations chart for Negro college graduates, about the question that divided two of the most significant men of the time, not a debate I had witnessed, but one I could sense in the intellectual atmosphere, the way you sense a weather system before you can see it. Mr. Booker T. Washington was the most famous colored man in America in 1899. His school at Tuskegee, his connections to white philanthropists and political leaders, his Atlanta Exposition address of 1895, all of it had made him a figure of enormous symbolic weight, celebrated by white Americans who found in his message something comfortable and celebrated, with more ambivalence by colored Americans who recognized both the genuine achievement his position represented and the cost at which it had been purchased. I had read the Atlanta speech. I had read it carefully, the way you read something you are trying to decide what to think about. Mr. Washington's argument, as I understood it, was essentially this: that colored Americans should concentrate on industrial and vocational training, on the accumulation of economic usefulness, on demonstrating through practical achievement that they were worthy of the rights and standing they sought. The political rights would follow from the economic standing, if the economic standing was solid enough and patient enough. Cast down your bucket where you are. The language was beautiful. The strategy, I could see even at 24, even with my limited experience, carried within it an accommodation with injustice that might be tactically necessary or might be a permanent wound, depending on factors that could not be known in advance. Professor Du Bois had not yet published his full public critique of this position. That would come a few years later, in The Souls of Black Folk. But I could sense his position in the way he framed the study's categories, in the space he gave to professional attainment, in the sentence he had asked me to write about the artificial constraint on professional income. He believed in the full assertion of rights, political, civil, educational, not as a future reward for demonstrated economic virtue, but as a present possession requiring only acknowledgement. I thought about this while I drew the occupations chart. The chart showed graduates entering law, medicine, teaching, the ministry, at rates that contradicted the assumption, widely held, frequently stated in the white press, that higher education was wasted on colored students, that they were better suited to the trades. The chart was an argument against this claim. The chart did not say so. The chart simply showed what the data showed. But the data, if you understood what you were looking at, was a refutation in bars and percentages, in the language that people who believed in numbers were supposed to trust. I drew the bars carefully. I drew them correctly. I understood that each bar was participating, without meaning to, without being able to choose otherwise, in a debate about what colored Americans were capable of and what kind of argument was required to demonstrate it. There were other voices in those months, not in the room, but in the larger room of the time, which I was part of even from my small table on the 4th floor of a building on Locust Street. Frederick Douglass had died 4 years earlier, in 1895, and his long life had cast a particular light over the decade that followed it, the way the light of a very large star continues to travel after the star itself has changed. Professor Du Bois spoke of Douglass occasionally, in a way that suggested not nostalgia, but inheritance, as though there was a tradition that had existed and was being continued, a tradition of insisting on the full complexity of the situation, rather than accepting the simplified version that was more comfortable for those who preferred not to be made uncomfortable. I thought about Charles Chestnut, who was publishing fiction in those years. His The Conjure Woman had come out that very year, and whose stories I had read with the particular attention of someone who recognizes a method, the method of showing truth through particular human cases rather than through assertions. Chestnut was doing with characters what the charts were doing with data, making the invisible legible by insisting on the precision of its rendering. The difference was that his characters could speak in their own voices, and the data points could not. The data points depended entirely on the person drawing them to understand what they represented and to draw them true. And Ida B. Wells, whose pamphlets on lynching I had read and whose method had seemed to me exactly right, the accumulation of documented cases, the names, the dates, the circumstances, the refutation of the justifications case by case, the insistence that if you were going to claim a statistical reality, you had better have the statistics, and they had better be correct. Her A Red Record, published 4 years prior, was a kind of model for what systematic documentation could do in the face of systematic violence, and I thought about her work sometimes when I was building the most difficult tables, the ones where what the data said was so plainly at odds with what the public record claimed that the accuracy of the data felt almost dangerous. Anna Julia Cooper. I thought about less often but more deeply. Her A Voice from the South had argued for the specific importance of the perspectives of Negro women, that the race's experience as generally discussed was really the men's experience presented as the whole, and that the women's experience, different in important ways, was systematically omitted. I felt the weight of this argument when I worked with the household data. The surveys had been answered mostly by male heads of household, when there was one. The women who ran households alone, and there were many, their numbers documented carefully in the occupancy tables, had answered for themselves. But the frame of the questions had not always assumed them. I noted this in the red notebook. I did not know what to do with the note, but I kept it. Paul Laurence Dunbar was publishing poems in those years, his dialect poems, which traveled widely and which people quoted at church socials and in parlors. I had mixed feelings about them that I could not fully articulate then and am still working out now. The dialect was genuine. He had grown up hearing it and he reproduced it with an affection that was itself a kind of argument. But the dialect was also the form that white audiences most readily accepted, because it matched what they expected, and within that acceptance there was a risk of being seen rather than heard, of providing the familiar image in exchange for the attention, rather than demanding that the attention come to you on your own terms. This tension, between the form your audience trusts and the argument you need to make, was one I lived with at the drawing table. The chart form was a form white audiences trusted. They trusted numbers. They trusted tables and graphs. Professor Du Bois was using these forms not because they were the natural forms for what he wanted to say, but because they were the forms in which his argument would be hardest to dismiss. It was in mid-December, a Wednesday evening, that Professor Du Bois came to the outer office late. I was finishing the lettering on a chart about church membership and property in Georgia Negro communities. I was perhaps an hour from completing it, and the completion was visible, the way the end of a long task becomes visible when you can see the remaining work from where you stand. I heard the outer door open and looked up. He stood for a moment in the doorway. He looked at the wall. I had been pinning the completed charts in order along the east wall as I finished them, each one wrapped at the edges with protective paper, a row of them extending from the window to the shelf. There were 37 completed charts on the wall that evening. He looked at them for a long time. He did not speak immediately. He was reading them, I thought. Not the individual data points, which he knew well, but the collective impression of 37 charts in sequence, which was something different from any one of them individually. "These are going to Paris," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "You understand what that means?" "People who have never set foot in Georgia," I said, "who have never spoken with a Negro American, who have ideas about us shaped by what they have read, or by what they imagine, or by the exhibits they have already seen, which have shown certain things and not others. They will stand in front of these charts." "They will stand in front of these charts," he agreed, "and they will see something they were not prepared to see. Because what they are prepared to see is not this quantity, not this precision, not this documentation." I understood what he was saying. The world had a picture of Negro Americans. The picture had been assembled over decades from sources that had particular interests in what the picture showed and what it omitted. The exhibit was a counter-picture, not an argument against the existing picture in the ordinary sense of argument, which can always be countered with another argument. Something more fundamental. Evidence. Evidence that required either engagement or deliberate rejection, and that could not simply be ignored because it did not fit the existing frame. "Do you think it will change anything?" I asked. I should not have asked. It was not my place to ask whether he believed his own work would succeed. But it was nearly 11 at night, and I was tired, and the question was real. "Change is not a single event," he said finally. "What we are doing is making it impossible for certain claims to be made without contradiction. Someone, somewhere, having seen these charts will have seen them. That cannot be undone. Whether they act on what they have seen is another question. But the seeing, the knowing that the documentation exists, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, the beginning of everything else." He left shortly after. I finished the lettering. I pinned the chart to the wall and covered its edges and went home through the December cold, and I thought, the whole way home, about the beginning of everything else. The Philadelphia Negro was published in the autumn of 1899. I had known it was coming. I had watched the manuscript assembled, had prepared its tables, had contributed one sentence to its prose. But the existence of the bound book was still a different thing from the existence of the manuscript. A book has weight. A book has a particular smell, new books and old books different from each other, and both different from paper. A book sits on a shelf and is still there the next morning. Professor Du Bois had a copy on his desk on a Monday morning in October. I did not mention it when I arrived. He did not mention it. He held it up briefly when I came in. Just a gesture, a brief raising of the book, and then set it back down and returned to the papers in front of him. That was all. I understood the gesture completely. I bought my own copy with my own money. I did not put my name in it. I set it on the shelf in my room on Woodland Avenue, between a mathematics text from my Baltimore school years and a collection of essays I had been meaning to finish. My name was not in the book, which was correct. I was an assistant, not an author, and the distinction was proper. But the figures in the tables were figures I had calculated and verified. The error-free figures, because I had tracked the errors and corrected them. The book existed partly because of work done by hands that were mine, and I understood this with a completeness that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something closer to the feeling of having kept a promise you made to yourself privately, without witnesses, in a cold room in January, when you first sat down and began to sort. January 1900. The final charts were completed, reviewed, and prepared for shipment. 63 charts in total, rolled in protective paper, placed in wooden shipping cases. Professor Du Bois traveled to Washington to meet with Thomas Calloway, who was coordinating the broader exhibit from the federal side, and to make final decisions about the presentation and arrangement. I stayed in Philadelphia. My salary did not extend to Washington or to Paris, and there was work remaining. Follow-up correspondence about the Philadelphia Negro, which was arriving in increasing volume as the book circulated, and a set of additional calculations Professor Du Bois had requested before he left. I stayed and I worked, which was what I did. But I will say, honestly, that the weeks in January after the charts were shipped were unusual weeks for me. The room on the east wall was empty, the pins still in the plaster where the charts had hung, the slight discoloration on the wall showing the shapes of the frames. 40 charts I had drawn, gone to Paris, being handled by people whose names I did not know, being mounted in a building I had never seen, in a city I had never visited. I would not see them again. I might never know exactly where in the hall they were placed, or which ones people stopped in front of, or which ones they walked past without pausing. This was a particular kind of distance, not geographic, though it was that too, but something about the relationship between making a thing and being present for what the thing does in the world. Most work involves this to some degree. You build something, it goes somewhere, you cannot follow it. But the charts felt more acute than most, because they contained so much of what I had understood about the work that year, about the relationship between accuracy and argument, about what the numbers actually carried inside them. All of that had gone somewhere I could not go. I wrote a letter to my mother in Baltimore. I did not tell her everything, I rarely did, but I told her that something I had worked on was going to be shown in Paris at the World's Fair, and that I thought it was good work, and that I was well. She wrote back and said she was proud of me, and that she had told Mrs. Hodge next door. I thought about Mrs. Hodge, who would appear in the data as a figure in the unskilled service category, and I thought that her neighbor's son's charts being shown in Paris would mean very little to her in practical terms, and something in abstract terms, and that both of these things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other. The letters about the Philadelphia Negro continued to arrive through the late winter and into spring. Most were complimentary in various registers, the formal praise of academic peers, the warmer and more personal praise of people who recognized their own lives in the data, the occasional letter from a minister or community leader asking how to obtain multiple copies. One letter was from a man who did not give his institutional affiliation, but who argued that the book's methodology was fatally flawed because it relied on self-reporting, and that self-reporting could not account for respondents who misrepresented their circumstances, either inflating their poverty to attract charitable assistance or understating it to avoid scrutiny. I read this letter twice. I thought about the forms I had sorted, the careful handwriting, the marginal notes, the man who had written about the Academy of Music in the space the form had not provided for him. I thought about the women who had noted, in the household expenses column, small amounts marked savings, amounts sometimes as small as 50 cents per week, maintained in households where the weekly income was barely sufficient for rent and food. Not inflated, not understated, precise. The precision of a person who has lived carefully and knows what things cost to the cent. I wrote a careful reply. I explained the verification procedures, the cross-referencing with external records where available, the multiple canvasser reviews, the internal consistency checks. I signed the letter with my name and my role. I set it in the outgoing correspondence pile. Then I took out the red notebook and wrote, "When the numbers are accurate, someone will always question the method. This is not a reason to be less accurate. It is a reason to document the process of achieving accuracy as carefully as you document the results." I underlined the last sentence. Professor Du Bois went to Paris in April. He wrote to the office, formal letters, addressed to the office generally, updating on the exhibit's installation and reception. The exhibit had been installed in the Negro building. The charts were displayed. Tens of thousands of visitors had passed through the exposition in its first weeks. There had been significant attention to the exhibit. The documentation, the charts, the photographs, all of it was being seen. I read these letters at my table in the outer office, in the room where the charts had hung. I thought, the line I drew, the property values line, going from 1.5 million to 12 million in 24 years, that line is on a wall in Paris. Someone is standing in front of it right now, perhaps, someone I will never meet, from a country whose language I do not speak, and they are looking at a line I drew with a ruler on a December evening in a small room on Woodland Avenue. And the line is saying something to them that I intended it to say, something true, something that could not be said any other way than this, not as persuasively, not as cleanly, not with the same authority that a number carries when it is correct. This thought was not a loud thought. It did not announce itself or demand recognition. It was the quiet kind, the kind that settles into a place in you and stays there, neither growing nor diminishing, simply present. A fact you return to occasionally in the years that follow, not for comfort exactly, but for orientation, for the reminder of what the work was for. A letter came for me in June, addressed to me personally at the department. Unusual enough that I turned it over in my hands before opening it, checking the return address, which said simply, E. Banks, Atlanta, Georgia. Miss Eugenia Banks wrote to say she had heard, through Professor Du Bois, that the charts had been well received. She wanted to record her satisfaction at this, and also to ask whether further projects of similar scope were being planned. She said she had found the work meaningful in a way she had not anticipated, and that she attributed this to something specific about the nature of the data, that it was data about people, and that this fact made the technical work of accurate representation feel different from other technical work she had done. She wrote, I found myself thinking as I drew of my grandmother who could not read. She appears in these charts, not by name, but in the generation-over-generation literacy figures, in the column that shows what was denied to those born before emancipation, and in the column showing what was built anyway in the years after. To make that second column accurate, to make the line go where the data required it to go, without softening or inflating, felt like owing her something. Like the accuracy itself was a form of respect for what she had managed without it. I read this letter 3 times. I set it down and looked out the window at the Locust Street building's roof and the wedge of summer sky above it. My grandmother had not completed her schooling. There had been no schooling to complete, or what there was had ended too early, for reasons that appeared in the before emancipation column that Miss Banks and I had both drawn. She appeared in those charts too, not by name, by the shape of a column in a chart that was now hanging in Paris, that had been seen by tens of thousands of people, that was making an argument she had never had the opportunity to make for herself. I wrote back to Miss Banks. I said I hoped there would be future projects, and that I agreed about the nature of the debt, and that I thought careful work was one of the ways the debt could be paid. Imperfectly, never completely, but sincerely. I sent the letter. It was the most personal correspondence I had conducted in the course of a year's professional work, and I felt the rightness of it. By late summer, the Philadelphia office was preparing to close. Professor Du Bois had been appointed to a position at Atlanta University, where he would continue the broader project of systematic sociological documentation, the Atlanta University Studies, annual publications covering different aspects of Negro American life. He was moving to Atlanta. The Locust Street office was ending. I was not certain of my next step. I had spent 2 years in this work, and I was 25 now, and I had learned things that I had not known how to want before I learned them, which is the particular problem of education. It shows you the shape of a capacity you did not know you were developing, and then you must decide what to do with that capacity in a world that may not have made obvious room for it. I considered Atlanta. Professor Du Bois mentioned, without quite asking, that there might be a role for someone with my particular skills in the Atlanta studies. I considered also staying in Philadelphia, where I had come to know the city and where there were other institutions, other projects, other people doing work of a similar kind. I did not decide immediately. I am still, in some ways, the kind of person who does not decide immediately, who prefers to live inside an uncertainty for a while before resolving it. What I did in that uncertain summer was continue to come to the office each day and do the work that remained. The follow-up correspondence, the final calculations, the administrative details of closing. I cleaned the outer room when the time came, swept the floor, stacked the remaining blank forms, returned borrowed reference volumes to the shelves. I took the pins out of the east wall one by one and ran my finger over the small holes they left in the plaster. The discolorations on the wall where the charts had hung were still visible. Professor Du Bois came to the office on a Thursday in August to complete the final packing of materials for transport to Atlanta. We worked together for most of the morning, boxing the files, labeling the crates, making the last inventory. The green ledger of the 7th Ward analysis went into a crate marked for the Atlanta University archives, where it would join the documentation of future studies, where it would become one layer in a longer record. I handled the green ledger carefully when I packed it. I was aware of handling it carefully. We worked mostly in silence, which is how packing tends to go. The work itself is not interesting enough to comment on, and there was nothing more to say about the larger work that had not already been said in the 2 years of doing it. At one point, he said, without looking up from the crate he was filling, "The exhibit may travel further. London is a possibility. Some of the charts may be shown in other contexts." I thought about the charts in London. I thought about the property values line being looked at by people in a different city, carrying different assumptions, seeing the same numbers through a different frame of reference. The line would still be correct. Whatever they brought to it, the line would still go where the data required it to go. "That is good," I said. "What you made will be seen," he said, still without looking up. "I want you to know that." I understood that this was a form of acknowledgement, more explicit than most he had offered, which had generally been implicit in the corrections he returned, and the occasional instruction that had treated my judgment as worth developing. I did not try to say something equal to it. I said, "Yes, sir. Thank you." We finished the packing. He departed in the early afternoon. I stayed another hour to close the office properly, locking the cabinets, returning the borrowed key to the building manager, standing for a moment in the outer room before I left it for the last time. The wall with the pinholes was the last thing I looked at. I am older now. The century has moved through things I could not have foreseen from the Locust Street office in the winter of 1899, and some of what I could not have foreseen has been terrible. And some of it has been, if not exactly what the charts argued for, at least movement in the direction the charts pointed. I still have the red notebook. It has sat on a shelf in every room I have lived in since Philadelphia, moving with me the way certain objects move, not because they are particularly beautiful or valuable, but because they are part of the record of what you were. In it are noted 47 errors I caught in the data during the course of the study, and the corrections made to each, and the date on which each correction was verified. 47 errors, each corrected, each correction making the record more accurate, each correction an instance of what I learned to think of as the basic commitment of the work. That the gap between what the data shows and what actually happened should be as small as it can be made, and that the making of it smaller is never finished, but is always worth continuing. I think sometimes about what those charts looked like to the people who stood in front of them in Paris. 63 charts in a room in Paris, made by 2 people in Philadelphia and Atlanta who never met, representing the lives of millions of people who would never see what had been made from their answers to 12 questions on a gray survey form. I wonder sometimes which chart people stopped at longest. I wonder if the property values line surprised them, whether the knowledge that a population legally denied education and economic standing for 200 years had nevertheless accumulated $12 million in assessed property in a single state in 24 years, arrived in those European minds as the specific surprise it was, or whether it was absorbed into some larger, vaguer sense of progress without the numbers actually landing. I cannot know this. I was not there. This is the condition of work that travels further than you can follow it. You make it as accurately as you can, and then you let it go, and you do not know what it does in the rooms it enters without you. What I know is that the work was done. The surveys were sorted. The columns were filled correctly. The errors were noted and corrected. The tables were drawn true to the data. The charts were drawn to the scale the data required and no other. Everything that could be made accurate was made accurate. And then it was packed in wooden cases and shipped to Paris and shown to people who had ideas about what they were going to see. And what they saw instead was 63 charts that said, "Here is what is true, documented carefully, with the method available to anyone who wishes to examine it." A true thing, carefully documented, is a kind of permanence. You can ignore it. You can attempt to dismiss it. What you cannot do is unmake it. The documentation exists. Someone made it accurate. Someone tracked the errors and corrected them and verified the corrections and handed the result forward into the world, where it went to places they could not follow and said things to people they would never meet. That is the work. That is all the work is, and all it needs to be. I was 24 years old, in a cold office on Locust Street, and I sorted survey forms, and I noted my errors in a red notebook, and I checked the columns twice, and what I made was true. I carry it with me. It does not get lighter, but it is the right weight for what it is.